What is your My House is Haunted story, part 2? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. I spent my childhood until I was 9 in McLean, Virginia, suburbs of Washington, D.C. I lived there with my parents and 3 siblings who were much older, 14, 16, and 17, until they had all moved out by the time I was around 6. The house was a single level with a large finished basement. I had various paranormal experiences as a child. The most common was a woman's voice randomly saying my name, even when my parents were out in the yard and I was alone in the house. It was never threatening, just a woman with a normal voice calmly saying my name. Though, of course, it scared the hell out of me. The other experience I had was really creepy. Sometimes, if I woke up in the middle of a night, a scene would be playing on my bedroom wall, always the same scene, an old-fashioned horse and buggy pulling up and a woman getting out. It was faded and jittery, like it was being played on an old projector and had a sort of strobe effect. Always the same scene, and then it would just stop, and the room would go dark again. The last experience I had was the scariest, and thankfully the last. It was the week my family was getting ready to move. My aunt and uncle had come down to help, and I was playing hide-and-seek with my cousins. I hid in a downstairs closet. The last thing I remember is a sensation of hands around my neck strangling me. The next thing I remember is my cousin standing over me screaming for help. My parents rushed me to the emergency room. They checked me over and could find nothing wrong. The doctor concluded I had suffered an asthma attack, though I had no history of asthma before or after that one event. So we move into a newly built and absolutely the most unhaunted house in existence, and over the years I just chalked my experiences up to an overactive childhood imagination. Fast forward 10 years. I'm now a freshman in college, and my brothers and sisters are all in for Thanksgiving. Conversation turns to the old house in McLean, and my sisters say, "I never was so happy as the day I got married and moved out of that haunted hellhole." This is the first I'd ever heard any of my family say they had similar experiences, so for the first time ever, we began comparing notes. My sister told us about seeing a woman in a white dress on several occasions. In one instance, she was laying in bed on the phone when she saw a woman walk into her bedroom, stand by the mirror, fidget like she was putting on an earring, then just walk out. My sister said she assumed it was our mom, though mom was always the blue jeans type, so my sister was curious why she was dressing up. So my sister hung up the phone and walked into the kitchen, and mom was just standing at the sink in her blue jeans doing dishes. She asked mom if she was just in her room, and mom said, "No, I've been doing dishes for the last half hour." My brothers seemed embarrassed and wouldn't go into the detail about what they saw. They just kind of blew it off by saying, "We saw some strange things, but we were smoking a lot of dope at the time, so who knows what was real and what wasn't." Likewise, my mom said we were pretty much all crazy, and she had spent more time in the house than anyone and never saw anything whatsoever. Though my sister told me later that wasn't entirely true, as mom had told her once when she was much younger about seeing the woman in white. She just said that mom was just so determined that none of them talk about it around me when I was young, and the subject was so off limits that mom had actually convinced herself it never happened. My dad had perhaps the most bizarre story. He was an electrician and had a workshop in the basement. One day he was working with a soldering iron, sat it down on the workbench, turned around to pick up a tool, and when he turned back around it was simply gone. Needless to say, he was a bit worried that a hot soldering iron had fallen somewhere and might start a fire, so he searched all over for it, but it was simply nowhere to be found. At first he thought one of my brothers was playing a prank, but he realized they couldn't have gotten into the workshop and grabbed it without him seeing, and when he went to check, neither of them were even home. Eventually he just threw his hands up in the air in disbelief and went out and bought another one. Then fast forward several months to Christmas time. The Christmas tree and all the decorations were kept in a closet next to the workshop. During the year there were boxes piled around the door, so it wasn't even accessible. Dad opens the door and turns on the light, and there lays his soldering iron right on top of the very first box, the cord tightly wound around it and looking like it had been gently sat right where it would have been seen. Curiously, this was the exact same closet I had the strangling incident in. Then, my dad tells a really scary story. He said that after he and my mom got married and bought the house, and before any of us kids came along, his niece was trying to get a job in DC, so she asked if she could move in until she found a job. He told her sure, and fixed up a bedroom in the basement so she could have some privacy. The first night, he and my mom were awakened to a loud scream. Dad grabbed his gun from the nightstand and rushed downstairs, thinking there must be an intruder. His niece was sitting on the edge of the bed, her face pale white, a look of terror on her face. He tried to get her to say what happened, but she would shake her head and refuse to talk about it. She absolutely would not go back in the basement and wouldn't even get near the basement door when it was open. She slept upstairs on the couch for 2 days until she could make arrangements to go back home. She wouldn't even go back in the basement to get her belongings. Dad had to pack them up for her. He really never had much contact with her after that, but eventually asked her mother if she ever said what she saw. Her mother claimed that she had seen someone come into the room. She thought it was just my dad coming back after having forgotten to tell her something. But when she sat up to talk, the figure of a man was grinning at her with a swollen, blackened face, eyes swollen shut, covered in blood, and grinning teeth protruding from shriveled, purple lips. After hearing all this, my sister gets curious and did some research. The house was part of a group of houses built by a housing developer in the mid-1920s. At that time, most people lived near where they worked, but he got the idea he could build a housing development for upper-income federal workers who would like to live in a more rural setting and commute to work. This idea was actually about 25 years ahead of its time, as suburbs really didn't exist in the 1920s. He worked out a deal with the contractor. If he built the houses, he could have one of his choice as payment. Unfortunately, when the stock market collapsed, the country went into a depression. Both the developer and the contractor lost everything. The contractor ended up hanging himself in the house he had picked for his own, which, you guessed it, was ours. The house sat empty for several years, and then was bought by a couple with no children. The husband died shortly thereafter, but the wife lived there for the rest of her life until she passed away and my parents purchased it. Reading between the lines, I think the bad spirit in the basement that my dad's niece saw and tried to choke me was the ghost of the contractor that had killed himself in the house. I think the lady in white was harmless, maybe even protective, probably the old lady that had lived there prior to my parents. I also think she was the one that whispered my name. As for the horse and buggy, I don't think that was really even related to the house, just some scene from long before the house was built that replayed over and over. On a side note, the house was torn down in 2009, and now a swanky-looking million-dollar home sits in its place. Not sure if the spirits have now found rest, but I have noticed the house has already been resold 3 times since 2012 when it was built, so people don't seem to be staying long. We knew a guy named Mr. Weltzheimer had died in our house, and when anything weird would happen, things falling off shelves or foreign coins appearing on the stairs, we'd joke it was him. One day, my mom and a neighbor were replacing the toilet in our bathroom and were busily working away upstairs when my mom heard the door open and close and a deep, booming voice say, "I'm home." She thought it was me, at the time a teenage girl, joking around, but it wasn't. I was over at a friend's house. When she came down to investigate, all she found were the locked front and back doors. Moved into a new apartment about a year ago, and shortly thereafter, I heard kids stomping around on the floor above. Oh, great, I thought, noisy upstairs neighbors. And then it hit me. I don't have upstairs neighbors or downstairs neighbors. The whole joint is mine from ground to roof. Some friends suggested that maybe I have raccoons or other critters in the attic, but I've had those before. They don't sound anything like that, and a week or two later, the raccoons in the attic were vacuuming the carpets. Must be ghosts. Actually, what it is some bizarre architectural quirk that makes stomping around on the floor next door propagate horizontally and sound like they're coming from over my head. Been living in apartments since 1978. Have never experienced this kind of thing before. Okay, I was in my bedroom at my desk on Zoom for school, and I always keep the door closed so there aren't any distractions. My room has a lot of empty space, especially at the entrance, and my desk chair faces the window so I can't see the rest of my room while at my desk. Well, one day I'm on Zoom for my English class and I hear my door stopper go off. You know those spring door stoppers on the bottom of the wall behind doors? I turn around and this thing is flicking back and forth, full speed and everything, and mine is pretty stiff too. My door never opened, and there was no one else in the room with me. I was scared to do my classes in my room for a whole month, but it never happened again. I was sitting in the living room watching TV with just me and my mom. The hallway had her and my dad's room at the end. As we're watching, we heard someone talking that didn't sound like it came from the TV. We muted it and heard it coming from the bedroom. The TV wasn't on in there. We both cautiously walked towards the bedroom and heard giggling, which freaked us the fuck out. It was coming from the closet, which was open, but we couldn't see anything in there. There was clearly a child's voice talking, but it was weird. Like words were spoken, but they weren't words. It was almost like something The Sims, where it sounded like words but was not. Thank God it was in her room and not mine. My old aunt used to complain that the next door neighbors were making all kinds of noise at 3 a.m. Number 1, I doubted she could hear them since her hearing was really bad, and number 2, those were just a nice family with 2 little kids, so I doubted they would be up making noise that late. When she died, before we sold the house, we pulled up the carpet, and there was a D sort of etched into the nice wood floors, and no matter how much we sanded it, it would not go away. Then the realtor was in the house taking photos alone in the house. She was in a room in the back of the house with a bank of windows and had closed the door of this room to get the entire view. She went to leave the room and could not get out. The door was not lockable, and she had to call out the window to people on the sidewalk to come into the house through the unlocked front door to let her out. The door that she was stuck behind opened easily. They even tested it again and it opened without a problem. There were other things that I'm not remembering now. We talked to the new owners after they'd been in the house for a year or more and asked how they liked the house. They said my aunt finally seemed happy with them and hasn't been haunting them as much as before. Moved into a 100-year-old house. Anytime I went downstairs while my daughter was napping, I would hear it running through the house. Several times I thought it was my cheeky toddler that had woken up. Figured out it only happened when I left her alone upstairs, sleeping, and firmly believed it was just a small child spirit checking on her. Still creeped me the fuck out. Came back upstairs one day and told it how I knew it was worrying about her and checking in on her, but that I would never go further away than the yard. That I appreciated that it cared, but it was actually making me really scared. I said that if she was ever in an actual danger, that I would absolutely appreciate its help if I didn't realize, but otherwise it was only making me worried. I only ever heard those footsteps once more. In the first few days I brought my second baby home from the hospital. I think my little friend was just reminding me that it would watch this baby for me too. This isn't a ghost story, but more of a psychic story, I guess. I was at a concert and I saw this guy in the crowd just standing there looking around. Everyone else was dancing and singing and having a good time, but he looked like he was hunting. I got a flash of rope in my car trunk in my head, and then I watched the guy start going up behind girls in the crowd and sniffing their hair. Like, oh fuck no. I went and got a cop, but when we got back I didn't see him in the crowd. I just hope nobody left with him. A house that my mom, my stepdad, and myself lived in years ago was once a meth lab where many people died in an explosion. This house always gave off creepy feelings. First day we were there, I noticed blood smeared on the back door, and I thought nothing of it, thinking maybe it was just mud, but this was in the dead of winter. Next, I was woken up in the middle of the night by gibberish being spewed into my ears and a hard, firm tug on my leg that couldn't have been a spasm because it pulled my entire body across my bed. We'd all wake up with several scratches on us. We didn't own a cat, but we had a Boston Terrier that had never scratched us before living there, so we didn't think it was her. Me and my mom had been hissed at by something. Once was when she was going to bring laundry in the basement when she was home alone, and she told me she screamed out loud, "Fuck this," and went into the dining room and immediately called my stepdad, trying to get him to come home from work. The inside window of the dining room decided to explode, and the outside one was intact. After we moved out, our distant cousins moved in, and they had told us they experienced similar things before we ever mentioned having anything happening when we lived there. Couldn't pay me enough money in the world to get me to live there again. Rented a 2-story house with a basement a few years back. Every single morning at roughly 8:30 a.m., we would hear footsteps going down the stairs from the second floor down to the basement. Eventually, we found a hidden room in the basement that the first time we entered it, my wife's phone went into super static over loudspeaker mode for no apparent reason, then stopped. When I got married, I had a friend come over the night before and we smoked some spice, synthetic weed, or so it was sold as. Turns out it's much worse, and I'm very glad it didn't kill me. He told me about a ghost in the house that was following him around and telling him to leave, left physical scratch marks on him. Same night, we heard a knock on the second-floor balcony, and we went to investigate. We could both very clearly see a corporal form or a ghostly visage, though we couldn't make out any specifically human anything other than its general human outline. Honestly, looking at it looked kind of like an almost invisible lightning globe thing you can get from Spencer's for $20, but that was literally walking around. Now, this isn't something that just I could see, or that just he could see. We could both see him in the same place at the same time. He asked us if he could come inside. I already know, majorly bad idea, we were high, and we said yes. We watched him come inside and sit down. We cut on a movie. We would routinely look at him and then each other, both verifying that the other could very clearly see him. He was still there, and we were both seeing the same thing. To be clear, two very separate people were able to see and speak to the same ghostly being at the same time. Again, we could both see him and could watch him move around. I have heard of mass hallucinations before, and I can't help but feel like this could be that situation. We were high after all. However, this was in a known haunted house, and two separate people were able to point out his exact location, completely separate of the other at any point in time, and there was never any disagreement on where he was. I can't stress this enough. We both thought we were going crazy and hallucinating at the same time, and thus would each check the ghost locations with the other at random points in time, and at no point in time were either of us wrong. We were both very clearly able to see this thing the entire time. He only left after we went to bed. TL, DR, ghost footsteps every day, messed up electronics with no clear cause, ghost visually observed by multiple observers at the same time for an extended period of time. Lived in a house near several cemeteries and some railroad tracks. I would sometimes wake up and see shadow-like people standing in my bedroom doorway. I dismissed it as my not quite awake brain manifesting things. Told my husband about seeing them and how I never felt unsafe, and after the first couple of times would just go back to sleep. One day he came home from work and told me my ghost hitched a ride with him. I had this doily angel hanging on a doorknob that somehow ended up in the backseat of his car. It wasn't something that could have just accidentally gotten scooped up. Didn't see shadow people after that, so I guess something hitched a ride on out of there.